Hello and welcome to another edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen. Well, today on the program, look up, look way, way up. We are going to look at the state of the aviation industry. Why do we have some of the most expensive airfares literally in the entire world? Would deregulation, more of it, really be the answer? How about competition? And what does the tariff battle really mean? Not only about those companies that build planes, but also the price of fuel that keeps them in the air. So we are going to one of our country's leading experts. He's now in the US offering his expertise to American Airlines there as well. Duncan Dee, former Chief Operating Officer and Vice President of Air Canada. And we should also say and you had many corporate jobs there, but you also in 2016 took on the role of reviewing the Canada Transportation Act, and we'll quiz you about some of that as well. So welcome and great to see you.
Thanks for having me, Senator.
You're in the center of the storm there in New York City and what's going on with tariffs. So we'll get to all that in a moment. But let me just start with the more general question, which is, does any country really have it right when it comes to cost-effective flying for the consumer that also has decent service?
Look, I think many countries have it right, and I think at some point we could have probably said that Canada had it right in terms of aviation and how we run the system, how consumers have benefited from the system. In Canada, I think things have just gone so far off the charts in terms of what consumers pay, the service they receive in return, and the fact that we're the only spot in the developed world that the ultra low cost carrier revolution has completely bypassed. And I think that if we take a look at what countries do this well, I think you can look at what's happened in the United States in the last few years, what's happened in the European Union in the last few years, where you've seen massive growth in air travel at very competitive prices. And then you can look even further afield, places like the United Arab Emirates and Turkey, where they've created these global powerhouse airlines by investing in these hubs. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and I think unfortunately for Canadians, the last place to learn those lessons is Canada.
I just, it twigged me last week. I was flying to British Columbia from Ottawa, coming back, sitting on the tarmac. The flight had been delayed an hour and a half. Yes, there were some weather issues, but can anybody explain to me why the pilots or why the staff will not talk to those of us sitting on the plane? I finally went up to the front and said, look, can you please tell us what you think is going to happen here, because we've all got meetings and things at the other end, and we'd like to be able to use our phones. And the head steward, the purser, was just so rude. And he just came back and he finally said to me, well, this is well within our flight plan. And I said, well, it's not in ours. Like we're an hour and a half late now. Like, why communication actually really annoys an awful lot of people. I know it's small, but is that a point of principle, or why don't they talk to passengers?
A big part of it, Senator, is when the flight crew in particular, the folks who actually would have that information to share, the pilots, when they're preparing to depart, that's one of the busiest times for the pilots. And so, at times, hopefully not all the time, but, obviously far too often, they just don't have the time, or they neglect to keep travelers updated. The problem that they face in, departing from an airport like Pearson or flying to a busy airport like Vancouver is, unless they get their departure times just right, unless they push back at the right moment, unless they get off the ground at the right moment, they can be held in a sequence and held before they can take off because they've missed their window. Right. And so I think that what you've got to balance off is these extremely busy pilots who are preparing to take off with the need to inform travelers. And what a lot of these pilots are balancing out is trying to give conflicting, sometimes fast changing information,
Right.
which may or not be valid because of things like what we have to do in Canada, like de-icing, things
Exactly.
that in many other parts of the world, aircraft don't get delayed for very well. And, we can talk about this a little bit more, but we've also gotten a lot worse at de-icing in Canada in the last few years. We're seeing many more
So
de-icing
much
delays. We're
time.
seeing, a capacity issue at many airports, or in places like Vancouver, an inability to deal with things like 2 centimeters of snow, because the system just doesn't allow them to handle it. So I think
No, I was
there's a
looking
lot
out
of
the
work.
window, and that's the point. I mean, they don't even have the snow plows, but I don't know. It just seems to me if they took 30 seconds and said, "We're still waiting for de-icing. We'll keep you posted." It would just like calm everybody down, and you can phone the person that's picking you up at the airport or cancel dinner or whatever it is, right? It would just make life easier for those of us that must fly because the distances are so great.
Senator, you're so right. And when I was head of operations at Air Canada, one of the banes of my existence was the communications to
Yeah.
customers, not just on board the flight, but at the gate.
Yeah, for sure.
Where announcements aren't made when announcements needed to be made, and the assumption that travelers would simply, put up and shut up and
Yeah.
just wait and be friendly Canadians and not
Yeah.
complain. And I think that that's something that we need to do better in the industry, and hopefully with a combination of technology and the information that's now becoming much more available at the traveler's fingertips. The information doesn't even just have to be verbal. It
Right.
can be pushed to people's phones. It could be made much more available to travelers than they have been in the past.
All right. So that's my little rant and rave for the day, although it may emerge again. I don't know. I somehow, because I spend so much of my life on airplanes, but I want to come back to that other issue because where we began this, which are there are countries where it works and countries where it doesn't. We have huge long distances, huge weather problems and differences, but we also have a very small market, which makes us different than Europe, which is very dense, or even the US, which has so many carriers and so much space to cover as well. How big an issue is that really that we're 40 million people?
Look, I mean, there's no doubt it's an issue, but I think that what Canadians need to keep in mind is that the geography over which we fly isn't actually, the whole north-south of Canada. You're flying along this 100-mile band along the
Right.
U.S. border, really, for most of us. Like, 90% of our travel happens in that small band with a little bit further up to Saskatoon and a little bit further up to Edmonton. But generally, we stick to that little band right across the country. So it's not an impossible distance to cover. And the 40 million consumers that rely on air travel in Canada, are no different than consumers in, say, Australia, where they have similar large distances and sparse populations. The one development, though, Senator, that I think Canadian policymakers have completely ignored in the last couple of years is the disappearance of the smallest gauge aircraft from the national fleets. In the past,
Yeah.
the smallest jet at Air Canada was a 50-seat Canada regional jet. Those are no longer operating. The smallest turboprops were 18-seat Beech 1900s or 37-seat Dash 8s, and those are all gone. And when you remove the smallest capacity aircraft from the fleets of the national carriers, what happens? You've got all of these small markets that relied on those small aircraft now having to fill bigger and bigger planes just to maintain their service. And that's just a huge challenge for many small communities.
Yeah, I mean, there used to be planes between Regina and Saskatoon. Even the flights between Regina, Saskatoon, and Calgary are now, a lot less because, as you say, they're waiting to fill a bigger plane. And so the number of flights, the number of options goes down. And one senses that if the flight isn't full, that sometimes those planes get canceled.
Yeah, I mean, when you're talking about the fact that the smallest aircraft now has 75 seats, where the smallest aircraft used to have 18 and
Right.
37 seats, going from 37 to 75 is basically doubling the capacity. So when you used to be able to fill four different 37-seat flights a day between Regina and Saskatoon or Regina and Calgary, and now you're needing to fill 75 seats every single flight, then there's a frequency trade-off, then you've got an inability to serve the market when the market wants to fly. And so what you end up with is a situation where it's tougher to fill bigger planes, but we don't have the small planes left to fill the gaps. So I
So
think that's something that policymakers in Canada in particular have just totally ignored.
what makes it so difficult for, like, when I was flying in the interior of BC on Pacific Coastal, I mean, they're the ones that are flying out to Penticton or to,
Exactly.
Kamloops, other places. But that's it, it seems like it's a tough business, and we've seen them certainly go down in my part of the world here in Western Canada, that they don't survive. What's stopping people from doing the small carriers as a standalone service separate from WestJet and Air Canada?
I mean, because Senator, most of the travelers that you cater to are traveling because of the network, not just between, say, Saskatoon and Regina or Saskatoon and Calgary, but beyond to cities further away. If you take a look at a typical flight, operated by either Air Canada or WestJet between, let's say, Regina and Toronto, or Regina and Calgary, or Regina and Vancouver. One-third of those travelers are actually traveling between Regina and Calgary. The other third are probably traveling beyond Calgary to another domestic point, so
Right.
Penticton, Kelowna, Fort McMurray. And then you've got another third that are going international to the States or to another country around the world. If you miss one of those three segments, then your flight no longer becomes profitable. And when you're a Pacific Coastal and all you've got to offer is a small regional network, it makes it very hard for you to attract travelers who are going further afield. And so you rely on a smaller market to fill aircraft, which are far too small today, given the fact that pilot costs have gone up, fuel costs have gone up, and so airlines want to amortize the cost of operating with more and more seats. But when you fly aircraft with more and more seats, the ones that pay the penalty are the ones from the smallest markets.
So this whole notion of letting others in, I mean, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around a bit here, but I'm just kind of reflecting back the conversations that I have sitting on planes with people, which is, it seems that Air Canada and WestJet have kind of divided up the country, and Air Canada's going to stay east and go to Europe, and WestJet's going to go west and go north and south. And I don't know, I kind of feel like I live in the flyover zone because really nobody much comes here. But, don't we need a little bit more activity? We make it so difficult with our foreign ownership rules, and with this whole thing about cabotage, which you'll explain to us, which is an American carrier can come here, but they can't operate internally in the country. So they can only go to Toronto, but they can't go to Montreal and pick somebody else up too, do Toronto, Montreal, and back to the US. Why do we have all of these seemingly nonsensical rules in a country that's so big that needs a little bit more competition because the price is prohibitive?
The price is prohibitive, and we've also, as a country, done a great job of chasing away airlines that offer low prices. Let's not forget that not that long ago we saw not one but two ultra low cost carrier failures in Canada.
Right.
Lynx Air and Swoop, which was taken over by WestJet. And what you end up with is fewer and fewer consumer choices and higher prices. And why do we keep chasing the ultra low cost carriers away, whereas they're thriving seemingly everywhere else on the planet? And I think The reason for that is twofold. You mentioned one of them, foreign ownership. You've got a small capital market in Canada for these airlines to raise funds in because, in order to take on the WestJets and Air Canadas, you have to have very deep pockets to be able to withstand the competition that you're going to eventually face from the two giants in Canadian aviation. So foreign ownership rules are definitely part of the problem. But not just the foreign ownership rules and limits themselves, but also the control in fact test that's within the Canadian Transportation Act. So you don't just need to be owned by Canadians, you need to also prove to the regulators that you're controlled in fact by Canadians. So it's not just a question of the right ratio of owners, foreign and domestic, but you have to prove that you're controlled in fact by Canadians. So that's
So what do
one
you mean
problem that we
monetarily or the management team or the board or what is that rule?
all of that. So, in order for a Canadian airline to be able to hold a Canadian operating certificate, a license to operate in Canada, they have to be owned majoritarily by Canadians. No single foreign owner can own more than 25% of the shares. And when you have, let's say two foreign owners owning 49% of the airline, you need to establish control in fact, meaning that the foreigners don't get to control the airline because they own 49% of the company. So, it's a multi-layered bureaucratic exercise, which many other countries accomplish by, what's the citizenship of your CEO?
Right.
What's the makeup of your board? Is your board majority Canadian? As opposed to then having to establish this control in fact, which becomes very nebulous when you're dealing with the regulators in Ottawa.
So we're seeing something like Porter Airlines, which started very small. It's now starting to expand across the country. They've got some bigger planes. I know when full disclosure, I used to sit on the board at the very beginning, not for many years now, but I see them with bigger planes trying to, go further afield and land. So are they big enough? Where were they able to find the money? To do that in a very, very tough market because it's part of the whole discussion we're having about tariffs and our battle with the US is we're not even productive enough here. We're not attracting foreign investment or even domestic investment in a whole range of industries, not just airlines.
I think Porter Airlines is probably the best air aviation entrepreneurial example we've got in Canada. When you were on the board of Porter Airlines, you'll remember that Porter wasn't just marketing itself as an airline; it was also marketing Toronto City Centre Airport
Right.
as the jewel in the crown, the airport in the heart of the Canadian commercial capital of Toronto. And so what they succeeded in doing where others have failed wasn't just running the airline, but also creating this hub in, an island airport in Toronto
Right.
that other airlines had ignored for decades. So the genius of Porter was being able to establish itself with enough heft at the very beginning because they frankly controlled all of the slots or most of the slots at Toronto City Centre Airport, and they were able to make a go of it. And as a result of that, they're now able to expand, like you said, by purchasing these brand new aircraft that can go coast to coast, and they can offer the service where there's no middle seat. And so I think that that's a huge competitive advantage for Canadians. They've also pioneered things like free Wi-Fi, which
Right.
travelers these days value, and that's something which the bigger airlines like Air Canada are now copying. And so I think Porter is one of the rare success stories in aviation entrepreneurship in recent years in Canada. Because frankly, we've seen the airline graveyard littered with
Right.
dead airline bodies, and Porter has been able to buck that trend.
So they are going to do a lot more, many more markets in this country, but in order for them to be financially profitable and succeed and buy the new planes, they can't they can't really service the feeder markets in the same way either, doing those small things that we were talking about before, because, you
Right.
know, the distances are great, but I mean, they're going a lot of places where the big guys won't go, and that's helpful.
Yeah, and they're actually offering nonstop services, which the big guys don't do. So instead of
Right.
feeding everything through a hub, they're able to offer, new services which other airlines haven't been able to do because of this type of aircraft that they've got and the network that they've been able to build.
Okay, are we really going to have to at some point allow American carriers to come and operate here more freely, not just to pick up somebody and take them to one venue in the one place in the US, or maybe do some of the hotspot destinations, but allow them to function here and compete?
So that is an extremely important question, and I think that the question we need to ask ourselves is whether, if we allow that, we want reciprocity. If we want our own airlines to be able to do the same in the other country that we would allow
Right.
um, to do that in Canada. So if we do want to have reciprocity, meaning that if a US airline can pick up passengers in Montreal and take them to Toronto, would we also want a Canadian airline to be able to pick up passengers in Tallahassee, Florida, and drop them off in Indianapolis?
Mhm.
If the answer is yes, then the biggest impediment to that actually isn't Canada, but it's the United States. The US will not allow a foreign carrier to serve two US points because, in, in exchange for the 40 million consumers that they would
Right.
get by having that right in Canada, a Canadian airline would get 330 million consumers in exchange. So they don't see that as a very fair trade. So the question is, should
That's actually
Canada
an
allow
excellent point.
unilateral?
I mean, it isn't a
Right,
fair
exactly,
trade. I mean, that, yeah, exactly. I get it.
exactly. And so the question then becomes, should Canada allow this unilaterally? Is it a
Yeah.
good thing for Canadian consumers? So that's the $64 million question. Since the 1990s, Canada and the US have enjoyed open skies. And so, you can fly to any US point with no restrictions on a US carrier as many times as you want. And really, the rules allow for that for both Canadian and US airlines. Now, when you take a look at what's happened as a result of that, you now have all of these airports across the country that have access to US hubs. United, for example, serves Regina to Denver. They're coming back
Right.
in May this year. So Regina will have access to United's hub there. Now, if United suddenly had the ability to serve two Canadian points, do I don't think it would be realistic for them to serve any other points than they already exist that they already serve today, because they don't operate any other hubs in Canada. The only markets that a US
Right.
carrier would ever be interested in would be the big volume trunk routes like the Montreal Toronto, the Toronto to Vancouver, the Calgary to Edmonton, the Calgary to Vancouver, those types of routes which have enough volume to justify a new entrant.
Yeah,
But
we've
those
already
markets
got
also are
service
our
there.
most
Yeah.
competitive.
Yeah.
Right. We've already got competition in those markets. So I think this is one of those things where if we allow US carriers to unilaterally do this in Canada, they're going to pick off the most profitable domestic markets and leave the rest of it to the Canadian airlines to try to make some money out of. And I
Right.
think that would actually undermine domestic service in this country. It wouldn't do anything to international or transborder service, but I think domestic service would be severely compromised.
So open skies, the ability to jump on a plane and fly somewhere, and also the alliances that we've seen. If you're on Air Canada, you can connect to a United flight and carry on somewhere else in the States. And um, is that enough? Do you think it's working?
I mean, I think the growth of alliances has influenced air travel around the world. So now you're not just relying on the Air Canada network, but because of the integration between Air Canada and its Star Alliance partners, United, Lufthansa, and many others, you end up with access to a whole worldwide network that you previously weren't wouldn't have access to. So that is a positive. But the one thing that Canadian consumers desperately want and need is lower fares. And that's something which alliances haven't been able to solve. That's certainly not something which Open Skies in and of itself has been able to solve, because while Open Skies has resulted in lower transborder fares, so lower fares between Canada and the US, it's done nothing really for domestic fares, which is where most Canadians find the most challenging prices in terms of trying to travel within their own country.
So
You and I have, you know,
you've explained all the reasons why that, can't happen in terms of, what the American carriers would do if they came here and why it's so expensive to have the small, cheaper airlines. It seems that they're run by the bigger companies anyway, so they're kind of cannibalizing their own flying, their own customer base. Like, how on earth do you ever get to lower fares if there isn't more competition? What other mechanism is there?
I mean, I think that we are going to have to make some serious policy choices going forward as a country in terms of what we want out of aviation. The one thing which hampers the ability of ultra low cost carriers and low cost carriers to enter the Canadian market and sustain themselves is the fact that we have this ridiculously high cost aviation cost structure in the country, which no other country in the world has. You've got this user pay model in Canada, which basically means that every penny that supports the air transportation infrastructure in Canada is paid for by air travelers alone. So, it's as if aviation contributes nothing to the economy as a whole. And so the only pocket that those funds will come out of is the pocket of the flying public. Just last year, the US government plowed 50 billion US dollars in American airports as a result of the bipartisan infrastructure program. $50 billion dollars into US airports to make them more resilient, to allow them to buy new, de-icing equipment, to allow them to expand terminal buildings and runways and aprons. Those are things which Canadian airports have to do on their own. And what do? They end up with these airport improvement fees, which are just a giant cash grab because they have no other source of revenue. In the U.S., you've got multiple sources of revenue, and it's not just the passenger paying the full freight, because there's a recognition that airports are an engine for economic development and economic growth.
So you could privatize airports and make them kind of standalone businesses, and they could have as much retail as they wanted, or some other way to do it. Or you recognize and accept the fact that in a country this large, airports are actually an infrastructure program that is worthy of government funding, at least to some degree, or some combination of those two.
Yeah, or you actually do something which would be virtually unheard of in Canada, which is plow back into the infrastructure what you take out of it. Right now, for example, the federal government receives $500 million in what they call ground rent. So the dirt under which these terminal buildings sit on, the government charges for that dirt every single year. So before a single flight takes off, before a single passenger boards a plane, the airports have to send $500 million to the federal government, none of which goes back into the infrastructure that it's supposed to support. So you've got all of these profit centers that the Canadian government sees aviation providing. So it's ground rent, $500 million goes there. Canadians pay some of the highest aviation security charges on the planet. So CATSA collects more revenues for providing air security that it spends on air security. Senator, you're so familiar as the former consul general in New York,
Yeah,
so familiar with LaGuardia Airport. And if you've been to LaGuardia Airport recently, you'll
it's
see these
amazing.
brand new,
I know.
amazing, brand new security equipment where travelers, ordinary travelers, don't even have to take out their liquids and gels from their bags anymore
Right.
because these new magnetometers are basically like CT scanners. They give you a 360-degree view of the contents of your bag. In Canada, where they collect the highest security charges on the planet, they're still using 9/11 era
Right.
X-ray machines. It's the same type of machines they've always used. But in the U.S., because they collect all these fees, they actually invest in this new technology that not only makes it more convenient for travelers, but it ultimately makes it cheaper for the airline operators to use because it's so much more efficient than what we have in Canada.
This is a really interesting concept because we have this on everything. I mean, the carbon tax you collect doesn't really go into solving everything goes into general revenues, and then government
Exactly.
decides how they're going to divide it up, mostly for political purposes too, but policy issues as well. So that would be a pretty radical change. Do you think I mean, you've been around this business for a long time. What happens when you have those discussions with government and say, okay, we'll pay the rent for the dirt, but please put some of it back into the issues that beset us, the infrastructure, the security issues. I mean, the list is long.
Well, Senator, one thing that is so bizarre in a country the size of Canada, you take a look at the United States and they have what's called the Essential Air Services Program. They've got all of these communities in the United States that are guaranteed air service because of government support. And what happens there is you've got all of these communities that wouldn't otherwise get air
Yeah.
service benefiting from air service because there's a program for that. In Canada, where we really have remote small communities, those communities are left on their own. There's nowhere for them to get funding. And when you've got these bigger and bigger planes to fill, a lot of these small communities basically just give up because there's no way for them to ever fill 75 seats on a jet, to Toronto every single day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. So I think we've got to seriously look at the underpinnings of the air transportation system in the country, how we fund it, how we run it, how efficient it is. And I think it goes back to the very start of our discussion. The Canada Transportation Act was last reviewed 10 years ago. 2025 was when David Emerson submitted the report of our panel. That report is supposed to be renewed every 10 years. So we're due for one. And hopefully a new government will be able to, undertake this review much more seriously than the previous government.
I mean, this is also, there's no incentive, it seems, in the system for the airlines to do anything about this themselves. Like, why would they lead and say, oh, gee, we're just gonna cut the fares on that route because it just seems so high. I mean, why would they do that when there's no support, infrastructure support from either provinces or federal governments or anybody?
Well, and
Municipalities, I guess.
actually recently, WestJet started the ball rolling. Air Canada matched it with these basic fares, and you just, Senator, remember the a public outcry that these basic fares were being introduced, which is basically the same fare that's been available in the U.S. and Europe and Asia for the past 5 or 6 years. We're finally getting to it in Canada, and
Okay.
as soon as it came out, the public reaction, the Minister of Transport, Anita Anand, called a meeting with every airline CEO to complain about the introduction of basic fares without really understanding the fact that Canada is really the last major market where these basic fares are introduced. But when you've got such
Explain
a
this.
high
Is it,
cost structure,
does this mean you get no peanuts and you can't check a bag, or what is this concept?
so I mean, the concept basically goes back to uh, a, a product which was not previously available to Canadian consumers. There is a segment of the population who, whether they're small business owners who need to take an overnight or a day trip, or a student going home from a dorm to their parents for the weekend. There is a segment of the market who all they want is the seat and the space underneath the seat in front of
Yeah.
them for their personal item. There is a segment of that market which has always existed, but what ended up happening was they either never bothered to travel, or they would travel very infrequently because they didn't want to have to pay the higher fare. So what's happened in the last few years is, starting with airlines in Europe and then in the United States and Asia, they started doing this. They started offering this basic fare to consumers, which resulted in their market expanding to people who used to not travel frequently. So not the Pamela Wallens of the world, but the individual out there who maybe is a small business person who doesn't have a client to charge the airfare to, but needs to go to a branch in Regina for the day or the night. And all they need really is their briefcase or their laptop bag, and away they go. Those are the types of consumers that benefit from these so-called basic fares.
Or as you say,
But
a
as soon as
university student going home for grandma's funeral, if you can book the flight and it's 11 o'clock at night, you're young, you don't care if you're doing an overnight or not getting enough sleep. So, but that's basically an online access point and a shorter time frame.
Yeah, I mean, it's a multitude of different market segments that the basic fare would appeal to. And what the biggest challenge they've had with the basic fare isn't the fact that there isn't a market for it. It's the fact that some people will buy it and then they forget that they bought a fare that didn't entitle them to a
Right.
bag, and then they get upset when they check
Yeah.
in. So
Oh
those are
boy.
things that those things come with time. And
Yeah.
as people become much more familiar with a fare that's brand new in Canada, but been around for years elsewhere, they get used to it, they plan around it, and it generally benefits consumers. But all of this doesn't address the fact that it's so expensive to operate an airline in Canada. And unless we address that, unless we address those fundamental cost issues,
Yeah.
Canadian consumers will continue to pay some of the highest airfares in the world.
Okay, I've got two quick points. I know I've kept you longer than we planned. Will we ever see another high service? You referenced Turkish Airlines or Emirates, where you can have your own bedroom and practically your own bar for a huge amount of money. People remember back to Canadian Airlines, where the food used to come down the aisle and you got real dishes. Is that ever going to be possible in this country?
I mean, I think that it's going to depend on our competitors. In many cases, airlines are the biggest copycats in the planet. They're the ones that look at what their competitors are doing and they want to stay ahead of the game. So if you take a look at international business class, the international business class product that you were describing with Canadian Airlines. And let's not. I might be dating myself, but
Yeah.
Ward Air was the
More there,
pioneer for the
absolutely. Yeah.
you know the food on the food service on the China. And so
That was the
I think that
ultimate.
there
Yeah.
is. Absolutely. Max Ward
Yeah.
made a killing with that service. And I think that that's something that I think will exist in some segments of the market. So if you take a look at places like Toronto, London, and Vancouver, Tokyo, you're going to continue to see that level of service. But I think domestically, if we're talking about domestic short haul business class, I think the days when you're going to get a full meal between Toronto and Ottawa in business class, or Toronto and Montreal in business class, or Calgary and Vancouver,
Yeah,
where
just not
you
on.
get a full meal served in China is not going to happen anytime soon.
How worried are you about the tariff battle and what it will mean for the price of fuel or the price of steel and aluminum, whatever it may be? Is this, are we in danger of seeing the prices push up even higher?
Look, I mean, that's an excellent question, and I would say that there are two huge vulnerabilities for Canadian Airlines. Number one is, a big segment of the Canadian traveling public are business travelers. And if the tariffs affect businesses to the degree that they're anticipated, I think what businesses cut first, the most
Yep.
the most optional cost for many businesses is travel. So
You
that's
do
a
the
huge
Zoom
risk
meeting.
to
Yeah.
Canadian Airlines.
Yeah.
Exactly. And then the second thing, which I think Canadian Airlines are paying attention to, are these online boycotts. You now are starting to see these online boycotts that Canadians are not going to want to travel to the US, for
Right.
example, because they're upset with what the Trump administration is doing. When you've got that, and if it does catch on, let's not forget that about one third of every flight departing, of all flights departing from Canada every single day, go to or from the US. A third of all flights, are between Canada and the US every single day. And if Canadians stop traveling south of the border, what do you do with those, one third of flights? And so I think those are huge risks for the aviation sector, and I think these tariff threats, will have reverberations not just in the industries that they directly target, but to the industries like the hotel sector, the airline sector, and all of these other businesses that rely on strong business activity to remain competitive and profitable.
Because if the tourist stays home, that's 4 or 5 jobs at the other end, any which way you look at it.
Right. And if it's a business traveler,
Yep.
for example, the ones that travel on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, they're the bulk of the travelers in the
Yep.
middle of the week. And if they stop traveling because of tariffs, then, what do you do with, the bulk of your travel during the weekday? So it's a very challenging time for airlines to navigate.
Duncan, thank you so much. This is you've really covered a lot of ground for us here today, and I think given us some things to think about that you don't go in, we don't go deep enough to think about what the issues are there. Really appreciate your insights. Very helpful.
Thanks for the conversation, Senator.
Yeah, we'll talk again soon, I'm sure. Duncan Dee, former COO, Chief Operating Officer, and Vice President of Air Canada, and now a consultant in the industry, and offering some obviously good advice on how we're going to deal with this on both sides of the border. So we'll stay in touch on that issue too. That is it for this edition of No Nonsense with Pamela Wallen, and we'll see you again very soon.